The Bitcoin, Ethereum, and Blockchain Super Conference is coming to Dallas, Texas, February 16, 17, and 18 in 2018. If you know of a better way to get the latest insider knowledge about crypto, to hear directly from the top minds in this field, to interact personally with 800 fellow crypto lovers, hodlers, investors, miners, traders, developers, and founders, then I'd like to hear about it. If you don't, then you don't want to miss out. Register today for the Bitcoin, Ethereum, and Blockchain Super Conference. Go to bitcoinsuperconference.com and register today as a super early bird to get the lowest rates on tickets and hotel rooms. That's bitcoinsuperconference.com.
Welcome to Almost Here, Round the Corner Future Technology Podcasts with Richard Jacobs. Future technologies poised to transform our lives for better or worse are the focus of this podcast. Almost Here means these technologies are now here and starting to be used, or just around the corner, from Bitcoin to artificial intelligence, 3D printing, blockchain, virtual reality, and more.
Hello and welcome everyone to the Future Tech Podcast. My name is Josh Thomas and I'm here with Joe Ciccolo of Bitaml and Amber Scott of Outlier. Hello people.
Hello.
Hello. Hi.
Hey, nice to have you here. And so it's interesting. It's kind of a unique podcast. We're bringing two different people from two different companies in two different countries, I just learned, to talk about sort of a similar topic. Both of your companies focus on AML compliance in the crypto space. And for those of you who aren't familiar, AML is Anti-Money Laundering. Coupling that with Know Your Customer, or KYC, are some of the basic requirements that are being enforced by most of the regulatory authorities in the crypto space right now. And so it's interesting. So Amber is in Canada and Joe is in the U.S. And you guys cover some similar ground. Joe, could you just kind of start here and talk to us about the development of AML, KYC, all this stuff over the last couple of years in the crypto space?
Sure. So we've been in the crypto space for almost 3 years now with BitAML. So we've seen a little bit of a change in that period of time, maybe not as rapid of a change as we would like in terms of regulatory clarity on certain things. But be that as it may, a lot of folks will remember that FinCEN was the first point of regulatory contact for the cryptocurrency industry. They issued guidance some time ago, as a matter of fact, as it pertains to money transmission. So they had said that anyone providing exchange services is considered a money transmitter, and among other things would have to register with FinCEN, which is a bureau of the U.S. Treasury, obtain or inquire about their status in terms of state licensing on a state-by-state basis, and then have in place a written AML compliance program, which is a core service that we offer at BitAML. So within that period of time, we haven't really seen too much more in the way of direct action from the federal level as it pertains to FinCEN and money transmission status. What's interesting to note is the states and how they've either held a sort of no action position, as we clarify the sort of gray area about the states as a no action position, and then some of the states have sort of evolved their position over that time. So it's been interesting. That's much more of a localized at the state level in terms of regulatory compliance application. But I think that in the time that we've been here for 3 years in the space, we've noticed more and more that the folks that are involved in the crypto space are much more informed about their AML compliance obligations, and that's certainly refreshing to see. And I hope that that's not a fact that's lost on our partners in the regulatory space as well.
Okay, so Amber, can you tell us what AML compliance is for? What are we trying to protect with all of these extra regulations?
Sure. And I wanted to just, before I do that, if I can hop in and just differentiate a little bit in terms of the Canadian context. Because in the U.S., what you had is the application of existing law, where FinCEN had said, yes, the existing money transmitter laws apply to the purchase and sale of digital currency. We had a very different take that we took in Canada. And perhaps that's in part because Andreas Antonopoulos was generous enough to come up and speak to the Canadian Senate Committee on Trade, Banking and Finance way back in 2014. And one of his recommendations was that we do not regulate right away, or at least take a more wait-and-see approach. So our government actually drew the conclusion that the existing regulations do not apply. So where we see compliance in Canada, we see compliance primarily on either a voluntary basis or because our banks and payment processors will act as de facto regulators. So in that case, a traditional bank or a payment processor might say to a Bitcoin exchange or brokerage that in order to do business with our bank, you must have a compliance program in place. And in those cases, they take the tack that it will generally be similar to a money service business compliance program.
Interesting. So in Canada, the regulations are optional?
So there are no regulations as yet that apply to, as far as anti-money laundering.
Okay, got it. Okay, thank you for differentiating that. I wasn't aware. And so it's possible that some sort of regulation could come down the line. It just hasn't yet, and there are banks and companies and exchanges that are voluntarily complying in order to do business.
Absolutely. And we expect that we will probably see draft regulations at some point, possibly even this year, but we haven't seen them yet.
And so, so good. So back to the original question. Now, for our audience, we see all these letters flying around, KYC, AML. And, a lot of people don't really know what it means, and they just, okay, I have to submit a photo of myself holding my driver's license and a picture saying this is only for Poloniex or whatever. Why do we do that? What are we protecting ourselves from with that?
There are a few different things there. So when we're talking about anti-money laundering, the core of that issue is that there are people that are doing criminal things, for instance, human trafficking, illegal arms trafficking, things like that. Those things are generating profits. And if I'm getting paid because I'm kidnapping and selling people, I probably don't want the payments that I'm getting associated with my name. So I want to be able to transfer those funds as anonymously as possible. I want to be able to move them around. I want to make it difficult to track.
There's not a sick code for that in the IRS tax code. What's your profession? Kidnapper? You can't.
There's not.
No? Okay.
No.
Okay, so then, and I'm glad that you're explaining this because it's kind of a foreign concept to a lot of us, money laundering. I mean, like, what do I take my money and put it in the washing machine? Well, yeah, kind of. What it is exactly what you described. You're doing nefarious things and making a profit, and you're putting that money somewhere else to obscure the source so that when people ask about it, you can say, oh, I got it from this other place. I mean, in a nutshell, that's what money laundering is.
That's exactly it. It's taking that dirty money and trying to make it look clean, making it look legitimate, or at the very least, making it more difficult for law enforcement to follow the trail.
So, Joe, let me bring you back in here. Many years ago, there was this thing called Silk Road, and that was the de facto king of money laundering at the time. I believe you could buy almost anything on there, no matter how illegal it was. And a lot of people were using crypto to do it. It was pretty much the only way you could transact business. Could you kind of like go take us back to that time and talk about, the rise and fall of the Silk Road and how that impacted money laundering regulations?
Sure. I think that Silk Road had a profound effect on the crypto industry and compliance in so many different ways, and probably beyond the scope of this opportunity to speak with you and your audience today, but I'll do my best. So Silk Road, for those that may be unfamiliar, was this online marketplace that sold products and services, many of which, if not most, were illegal and centered around illicit drugs and other activities. It just so happened that they used Bitcoin as a payment rail. And the reason they used Bitcoin was for its utility. Oddly enough, Bitcoin presented the opportunity for instant payment. It could be done online, and at the time, many people believed it to be completely anonymous, which in time we've sort of dispelled that myth that it's in fact pseudo-anonymous. So here you have a gateway for instantaneous transactions that could be done in such a manner that many people believe they're anonymous. So that could lend itself as a great utility for many different commerce, online and otherwise, and illegal and otherwise. And so what happened, because it was so early in the era of crypto and a digital currency and of Bitcoin and Silk Road became intertwined in media and in ways in which people viewed that particular industry. And the timing was terrible as well because we started to have regulatory interest in the space. So as regulators started to, sort of come out of their shell and say, hey, what's this Bitcoin thing all about? Let's take a look at it. The lead, anytime they went to do an online search or, asked individuals within their circles about Bitcoin and cryptocurrency, inevitably Silk Road was tied into that. So it didn't really, as an industry, put us off on a good footing. And it's interesting to know, kind of looking back on Silk Road and its impact on the crypto space from a non-compliance standpoint, that many folks, including myself, feel that Bitcoin would not be where it is today in terms of funds moving around and liquidity were it not for Silk Road. So in some perverse way, this illegal online marketplace actually helped propel Bitcoin not only into the spotlight for good or for ill, but also jump-started this cryptocurrency and highlighted its use as an instantaneous method of transacting pay.
As a Hollywood agent would gladly tell you, there's no such thing as bad publicity. No?
Ross might disagree with that, but I think generally speaking,
as far as Bitcoin goes, at least it got it into the limelight. But yeah, I would say that Ross is not in agreement there with us. So Ross Ulbricht was the founder of Silk Road. In fact, if anybody's interested, if you're listening to this, Ross's mother, Lynn, is going to be at our conference speaking. So controversial topic for sure, but definitely an interesting one. And so, Joe and Amber, take us back to as you're building your own company here. What is the mission of Bitaml? What is the mission of Outlier? How can we help get more companies in compliance and help them understand and educate them on why that's important?
I think for us, you hit the nail right on the head. It's a lot about education. It's about getting good information in the right hands, keeping companies out of trouble, certainly helping people to understand those boundaries as they begin to innovate. And I think that innovation is great. I think that risk-taking is great, but you have to understand the context of the risk that you're taking. And one of the biggest challenges that we face is that cross-jurisdictional challenge. So we're located in Canada, and we'll often deal with the question of, well, we'd like to also do business in the U.S., and what does that look like? And how is that different from doing business in Canada? And this comes into play in a number of different contexts. One of the ones that I think that comes up recently that's been pretty prominent is with companies that are launching new coins that aren't necessarily doing business in the U.S. because, as we see it, the Securities and Exchange Commission in the States is essentially the old school Wu-Tang of regulators in that they're really nothing to mess with. They've taken a much more aggressive approach than other regulators, and part of it is helping companies to get good information in their hands, to understand that context, to take educated risks, and to do the things they need to do to get in compliance and stay in compliance.
Okay, and so that's certainly a topic that's going to come to a head in 2018. From my perspective, is there is a vast amount of ICOs. Maybe it's slowed down a little bit this month, but there are more and more every day, and it's picking up steam. And you're starting to see some of them that are going through the expensive and lengthy and difficult process of getting approved by U.S. regulators. And then you're starting to see others that are just retreating further and further into the shadow. And so it's kind of like drawing a big line in the sand. Can you speak to, either one of you, can you speak to what's going to happen? Ultimately, it's getting harder to create an ICO because the regulations are coming down in almost every country now. Can you speak to how that's going to change the landscape of the ICOs in 2018?
Sure. We're already starting to see it change the landscape, and this began, I would say, late last year as the SEC became, Securities and Exchange Commission, that is, became much more vocal, both in terms of administrative rulings and press releases and other media touch points with the industry, became much more aggressive in their language and much more assertive in the process. And we've actually seen, at least here at Bitaml, less volume in terms of inquiries from prospective and existing ICOs. And in fact, it's come to our attention that many ICOs, either those going to market or those proposing to go to market, were not expecting to meet their benchmarks in terms of the amount of capital they've raised, or having trouble reaching some of those benchmarks. And I think a lot of the regulatory attention on the space really got some folks thinking, is this A place I want to be? And then B, can I actually make a go of it? Is it worth that opportunity? And I think that as there's a lot more attention on that, there's sort of a risk analysis, if you will, sort of a back of the envelope risk analysis being conducted by some folks that were interested in the space, and some talent, unfortunately, decided to move on to other areas of the crypto market. And I think it's already had that sort of chilling effect. And we've also seen many cases where those that initially were enthusiastic went to market with their ICO, but ultimately decided, in the best interest of, among other things, consumer protection, and maybe we could argue self-preservation, decided to return those funds and take a step back and sort of just distance themselves from that market and from that opportunity. So to answer your question, I think that's going to continue into 2018. I think ICOs are still going to be around, but I think the euphoria and the drive to be a participant in that space is going to diminish. And I think there are other areas of crypto that will benefit from having those awesomely talented individuals move over from ICOs to somewhere else.
You know, I was watching a time-lapse graph of ICOs and the market cap of crypto. I wouldn't know how to find it again, but it was just like it was moving really fast over the last 4 or 5 years. And there was, you know, the Bitcoin white paper, and then nothing, and then, you know, Ethereum came out in 2014 or something like that, and then nothing, and then in 2017 it just blew up, you know, ICO every minute.
So I have sort of an issue with that one in both the description of Bitcoin and the description of Ethereum as ICOs, in part because with either of those projects, and I really challenge anyone, please send it to me if you can find it, to find something from 2014 Ethereum back in those early days when it was, when there wasn't actually anything more than some slide presentations and some concepts. So when it sort of looked in certain regards like ICOs look today, to find something where people were talking about invest, because my remembrance of that is that everyone at the time was really talking about platforms, they were talking about ideas, they were talking about building things. There wasn't the same level of consideration or chatter at all about price, and certainly I don't recall anyone from the Ethereum project at that time going out and talking about buy this, it's going to be a great investment, where I would say that is the vast majority of the chatter today. So it's a very different historical context.
Right. Yeah. So thank you for the color that you've added to this. So going back to the point, the reason I was bringing that up is in 2017, the amount of projects, whatever you want to call them, however they were motivated, exploded and created a lot of noise in the industry. And so back to your point here where it says this was a platform that was not about investment, but it was about utility. That changed. It seems like that changed in 2017 or the tail end of 2016. And it's created so much noise that the platforms that do have utility are really struggling to get any attention because everywhere you look, I mean, I could go and start an ICO tomorrow and not know anything about development and not even have a white paper. I could still do it. You
could just hire a marketing team to encourage people to throw their money into your dumpster fire, and some probably would.
Yeah, many have. And so what do you, as compliance people, what do you see as a remedy to that, where we can at least just kind of lower the noise level to where only the legitimate products are standing out?
Well, if only it were that easy. I think regulation may be I think regulation may be a piece of that in order to sort of help weed out the good from the bad. But as you mentioned, sometimes, and with the insertion of regulations and regulatory interpretations that can slow the process down and that cast a wider net than may be expected. So it's a little concerning for us to sort of see that. And what do we do in the area of consumer protection? Well, our firm, about a year ago, we started advocating more aggressively to our clients and to the industry itself that consumer protection was going to be this next touch point in the greater context of regulation, that AML and KYC, well, they're not going anywhere at all. They're here to stay, and they are still that centerpiece, that center touch point in terms of compliance. We felt that consumer protection was really going to be a strong piece of the puzzle in terms of compliance moving forward, especially as the industry began to scale and began to take on more mainstream clients to the space, or as I affectionately refer to them, mom and dad, beyond the circle that we have now in the space. And we began to see that some concern that as more mainstream audiences came on board and as companies scaled, they'd have trouble adapting, and we might have some consumer protection issues. Of course, no way of knowing that ICOs would have taken off like this, but still the message is there that consumer protection is very important, and that begins with something as simple, or may seem as simple, as having some clear disclosures and expectations up front. Generally speaking, if your lead is about price and how much money you can make, and what size yacht you'll have after this is done, that's generally sort of a red flag. And I guess to that point, a larger observation within the context of fraud and consumer protection, some of the technologies have and will continue to change, but some of the scams and some of the workarounds, or some of the ways in which individuals structure things, those types of things will always be relatively the same. It's just the technology has changed, and so it's about information, about education, as Amber said, really reaching out to not only the consumer, but also these businesses and these ICOs and folks getting involved in the space to not only be upfront about it, but really to level set in terms of expectations so there's no misinterpretation. It's our belief that a lot of consumer complaints to government agencies tend to begin with something as soft as a complaint about a particular service or a reaction to something that they said. These little micro moments that could have been dealt with by level setting with that particular person up front, and or by being more responsive to that in a reactive capacity. So we're encouraging our clients, and I'm sure Amber is doing the same thing, to be on top of consumer protection, to really have those steps in place, and to be able to fully engage with their customer. And it's, by the way, it just happens to be good business in general, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah, sometimes if you just treat people like you would treat your mother or your uncle or your cousin, then you're going to be okay if you just do it right. And speaking of, I hate to give these guys, because there's no such thing as bad publicity. In my research, I was poking around on Bitcoin Talk or something, and I literally found a program called Moon Lambos, which is about going to the moon and buying your Lamborghini. And but that
capitalizes on a particular feeling, right? A particular sense, a particular fear of missing out. It capitalizes on all of these articles you see that say things like, if you had bought $1,000 worth of Bitcoin back in 2010, well, I mean, you did that if you were on a particular cypherpunk mailing list that knew about Bitcoin at that point in time. No one was really investing in it at that point in time. It wasn't something that people looked at in the same way. And that's really hard to put in perspective, because we see things with the lens of almost a decade later. We're looking back at it and saying, well, yes, that's the way the mathematics worked out, but it could have worked out very differently. The other bit that I would say, just for consumers in general, so not even as a compliance person, but just as a member of the public that consumes goods and services, is that that fear of missing out and the way that that's been capitalized upon has led people to make a lot of bad decisions. And I've heard people say things like they've just bought a portfolio of ICOs, and they just sort of went online and looked at what potential tokens they could buy, bought those tokens with no research. And I talked to someone who did this and said, would you ever have done the same thing with a stock? And they said, well, no, but I would also never expect a stock to go up 100%. 100 times over the course of a year. So in a funny way, I think that as long as those incentives are there, people are going to take risks, only seeing the potential upside to it.
Yeah, very good.
Until that upside isn't there.
Yeah, and I would echo what Amber has said. I think in the historical context of Bitcoin and later on cryptocurrency, we never thought of it early on as this, investment vehicle, as this currency even. It was more about, and I'm sorry to be nostalgic, it was more about creating this new way of financial services. And over time, the shorthand that began to play out was Bitcoin has a value relative to the US dollar. And so when I give presentations and bankers ask me, how much is one Bitcoin worth? I said, well, it's always been worth one Bitcoin. It just so happens that we measure our daily lives here in the U.S. in dollar denominations. And so what you're asking me to do is to take what it's worth, one Bitcoin, and apply it to your system of dollars. And so I can see the gears moving at that point. So in some ways, it has become, at least to the general public, more analogous to a stock. And I think not only does that miss the point in the spirit of Satoshi and of Bitcoin, but it also skews our thinking about this, and it becomes this sort of, how do I make money because everybody else before me made money? And what we tell our clients about cryptos is when they talk to me and they say, hey, I want to invest in Bitcoin or Ethereum or Litecoin or some crypto or altcoin, I say, okay, well that's interesting. I'm glad you're interested in the space, but I want you to do some research and get to know the utility and the story behind it. And once you can appreciate those factors, then I want you to think about if you want to get involved in the space with a purchase of a crypto or trading or something like that. Because I think with that appreciation, then you have the right lens, then you have the right context, and it becomes more about appreciating the space you're in and those involved, rather than this sort of, how can I make money as fast as I can because somebody else did so 7 years ago.
Yeah, very
I agree
good.
with that completely. That's even one of our questions when we're looking at startup clients that come to us to have work done. Part of my question isn't just what does your company do, but what problem are you solving? And if as a startup you can't answer the question of what problem you're solving, I'm probably not going to work with you.
Yeah, wise words for sure, and it's definitely a problem that is rampant. I've talked to a lot of those guys myself, and knowing what problem to solve is kind of question number one for sure. So hey guys, we're running long here and we need to wrap. So quickly, Joe, tell me how people can learn more about Bitaml and who's a good candidate for you.
Sure. So who's a good candidate for us? We love helping people out in the crypto space. Even if you're at the early stages where you're doing research, there's no need to apologize for what stage you are at currently. Just find us online at Bitaml, Bitaml.com. Or if you want to just talk to me directly, I always love to get email from folks, questions big or small. So you can hit me up at Joe, J-O-E, at Bitaml, Bitaml.com. And we're also on social media, so if you want to see the latest and greatest of what's going on in the regulatory space as it pertains to crypto, definitely check us out on Twitter, LinkedIn, and Facebook. We're delighted to share our knowledge with the space and, of course, answer any questions you might have. Very
well. And Amber, tell us, for our Canadian counterparts, tell us about Outlier.
Perfect. So we're online at outliercanada.com, O-U-T-L-I-E-R, Canada.com. At Outlier Canada is also my Twitter handle. If you'd like to get a hold of us, send us an email at info@outliercanada.com.
Very good. So Joe Ciccolo from Bitaml.com and Amber Scott from OutlierCanada.com. Thanks very much for joining us and discussing this crucial yet often overlooked topic. I really appreciate your time today.
Thanks for having us.
Thanks so much.
All right. That'll do it for this episode. We'll see you next time on the Future Tech Podcast.
The Bitcoin, Ethereum, and Blockchain Super Conference is coming to Dallas, Texas, February 16, 17, and 18 in 2018. If you know of a better way to get the latest insider knowledge about crypto, to hear directly from the top minds in this field, to interact personally with 800 fellow crypto lovers, hodlers, investors, miners, traders, developers, and founders, then I'd like to hear about it. If you don't, then you don't want to miss out. Register today for the Bitcoin, Ethereum, and Blockchain Super Conference. Go to bitcoinsuperconference.com and register today as a super early bird to get the lowest rates on tickets and hotel rooms. That's bitcoinsuperconference.com. You have been listening to Almost Here,
Around the Corner Future Technology podcast with Richard Jacobs. Subscribe to this podcast, post a review to discover more future technologies that are poised to transform our lives for better or worse, such as Bitcoin, artificial intelligence, 3D printing, blockchain, virtual reality, and more.